An old recording of his voice filled the arena. Bob Dylan's own voice, 40 years younger. And he froze. The concert was in its third song. Madison Square Garden, November 2009. 18,000 people in the dark, watching a 78-year-old legend stand under a single spotlight, guitar hanging from his shoulder, that weathered face catching the amber stage light. Dylan had been playing "Don't Think Twice, It's Alright." His fingers moved across the strings with the muscle memory of 5 decades. His voice, gravelly now, worn smooth by time and cigarettes and 10,000 performances, pushed through the lyrics with that familiar detachment. The crowd swayed. Some sang along quietly. This was what they'd come for. Not perfection. Not nostalgia. Just presence. And then the sound system crackled. A technical glitch. Someone in the booth would later claim it was a feedback loop. Others would say it was a crossed wire. The official explanation didn't matter because what came through the arena speakers in that moment wasn't feedback. It was Bob Dylan's voice. But not the voice that had been singing seconds ago. Not the gravelly rasp of an old man. This was different. Higher. Clearer. Raw with youth and urgency. It was Dylan from 1965. A bootleg recording. It's alright, Ma, I'm only bleeding. The version from the Newport Folk Festival, before he went electric, before the controversies, before fame calcified into legend. The young voice filled 18,000 cubic feet of arena space. Angry. Defiant. Alive with the kind of certainty only 24-year-old prophets possess. Dylan stopped playing. His fingers went still on the fretboard. His mouth closed mid-lyric. He stood there, guitar in hand, spotlight burning down on him, and listened to himself from 44 years ago. The crowd didn't know what was happening. Some thought it was part of the show. Others looked around confused. The band behind Dylan, barely visible in the darkness, had stopped too, waiting for a signal that never came. And Dylan just stood there. Frozen. Staring into the dark beyond the lights, listening to the ghost of who he'd been. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. The sound engineer cut the feed after 30 seconds. The young voice disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived. Silence filled the arena. 18,000 people holding their breath. Dylan lowered his guitar slowly. He turned and walked to the back of the stage where a folding chair sat in shadow. He sat down. Under the lights, in front of thousands, Bob Dylan sat in that chair and put his face in his hands. The crowd waited. No one moved. No one called out. They understood, on some instinctive level, that they were witnessing something that transcended performance. After what felt like minutes but was probably 40 seconds, Dylan stood up. He walked back to the microphone. He didn't pick up his guitar. He just stood there, hands at his sides, and spoke. "That was me," he said, his voice barely amplified, rough as gravel. "Long time ago. Different person." He paused. The silence stretched. "I don't remember being him. To understand what happened in that moment, you need to understand what happened in 1965. Bob Dylan wasn't always Bob Dylan, the untouchable icon who existed somewhere beyond normal human experience. In 1965, he was 24 years old and drowning under the weight of something he never asked for. He'd written, "Blowin' in the wind." He'd written, "The times they are a-changin' dot." And suddenly, without his permission, without his understanding of what it meant, he'd become the voice of a generation. The spokesman. The prophet. People looked at him and saw their revolution. Their hope. Their anger at the world that was and their dream of the world that could be. Bob Dylan looked at himself and saw a kid from Minnesota who liked writing songs and didn't understand why everyone expected him to have answers. The pressure was constant. Journalists asking him to explain the meaning of his lyrics. Activists demanding he show up at protests. Folk purists insisting he maintain the purity of acoustic guitar and political consciousness. Fans treating every word he spoke like scripture. He tried to tell them. In interviews, in songs, in the way he deliberately sabotaged his own image. "I'm not a leader," he'd say. "I'm just a musician." But no one listened. They heard what they wanted to hear. By the summer of 1965, Dylan was exhausted. Not physically tired, though he was that too, burning through tours and recording sessions and obligations. He was exhausted by the persona. By Bob Dylan, the symbol, the voice, the answer to questions he never understood. At the Newport Folk Festival that July, he made a choice. He walked onto the stage with an electric guitar. The folk community had expectations. Acoustic guitars. Protest songs. Purity. Dylan gave them amplified rock and roll and a middle finger to everything they thought he owed them. The crowd booed. Pete Seeger reportedly tried to cut the power cables with an axe. Dylan finished his 3-song electric set and walked off stage to a mixture of cheers and fury. Backstage, he sat on a wooden crate in the corridor, still holding that electric guitar, and cried. Not because they booed him. Because he'd finally done it. He'd killed the thing they'd built. He'd proven he wasn't their prophet. He was just a person who wrote songs and couldn't carry the weight of their dreams anymore. His manager found him there. "You okay, Bob?" Dylan looked up, tears still wet on his face. "I just want to play music," he said. "That's all I ever wanted." "Why isn't that enough?" "Because you're too good at it," the manager said. "People need heroes." "I'm not a hero," Dylan said. "I'm just a kid who got lucky." That recording, the one that would accidentally play in Madison Square Garden 44 years later, captured the acoustic set from earlier that same day. Before the electric guitars. Before the booze. When Dylan still sounded like the voice of hope, before he'd deliberately broken that voice to prove he was human. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. In the decades that followed, Dylan ran from that kid. Not consciously, maybe. But he changed his voice, changed his style, changed everything about himself except the core act of writing and performing. He went electric, then country, then gospel, then whatever felt true in the moment. He gave interviews where he deflected, obfuscated, told stories that contradicted other stories. He built a wall between Bob Dylan the person and Bob Dylan, the myth. He got older. The voice changed. The face weathered. The hair went from dark to gray to white. He became what he never wanted to be in 1965, an institution. A legend. Someone whose early work was studied in universities, whose lyrics were analyzed for meaning he swore he'd never intended. And he accepted it. Not happily, but with the resignation of someone who learned you can't control what people make of you. But he never listened to those old recordings. Never went back to 1965, to Newport, to the kid who'd cried on a wooden crate because being a prophet was too heavy a crown. Until tonight. November 2009. When a sound system glitch forced him to hear that voice again. Standing on the Madison Square Garden stage, Dylan had looked into the darkness beyond the lights and heard himself from before. Before the weight. Before the walls. Before he'd learned to protect himself by becoming unknowable. And he'd frozen because that voice, clear and certain and so unbearably young, sounded like a stranger. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. After sitting in that chair, after standing up and saying those few words, Dylan walked back to his guitar. He picked it up. He adjusted the strap with hands that moved slowly, deliberately, like a man making peace with something. "I'm gonna play that song now," he said into the microphone. "The one you just heard. The way I play it now. Not the way I played it then." He started, "It's all right, Ma, I'm only bleeding." But it wasn't the same song. Not really. The lyrics were identical. Dylan's lyrics never changed. That was a point of pride. But everything else was different. The tempo slower. The delivery rougher. The anger replaced by something that looked like sorrow from a distance but was really just acceptance. The young Dylan had sung it like a manifesto. The old Dylan sang it like a eulogy. The crowd listened in silence. Some had tears on their faces. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because they were watching a man reconcile with his own ghost in real time. When the final chord faded, Dylan stood there for a moment, head bowed. Then he looked up at the darkness where 18,000 people sat invisible. "That kid from the recording," he said. "He thought he had all the answers. Turned out he just had all the questions." A pause. "Took me 40 years to figure out that was better." He started the next song without waiting for applause. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. The concert continued. Dylan played his set. The audience eventually remembered how to respond normally. The technical glitch became an anecdote, a story people would tell. "I was there the night Dylan's own voice came through the speakers and stopped him cold." But something had shifted. In the dressing room after the show, Dylan sat alone for a long time. One of his longtime bandmates knocked on the door. "You alright, Bob?" "Yeah," Dylan said. "Just hadn't heard that recording in a long time. Heavy hearing yourself that young. Heavy hearing someone I don't remember being." Dylan looked at the guitar case propped against the wall. He was so sure. About everything. Music, politics, what mattered. "I don't remember what that felt like." "You regret losing it?" Dylan thought about that. "No," he said finally. "Being sure is for prophets. I never wanted to be a prophet. Just wanted to be a musician." "You are a musician." "Yeah," Dylan said. "Took me a long time to figure out that was enough." 3 months later, Dylan was in a recording studio working on new material. During a break, his producer asked if he'd ever want to re-record some of the early songs. "Bring that Newport sound back. People would love it." Dylan shook his head. "Can't bring it back. That kid's gone. And if I tried to sound like him, I'd just be doing an impression of myself." "So you just let those versions stay in the past?" "They're not in the past," Dylan said. "They're where they always were. They're who I was then. I'm who I am now. Both things are true." He paused, thinking about that night at Madison Square Garden. The frozen moment. The voice from 1965 filling the arena. "You know what the hardest thing is?" Dylan said. "It's not getting old. It's not losing your voice or your speed or whatever. It's accepting that the person you were, that person people loved, that person who changed things, is actually gone. They existed, but they're not coming back. And you have to be okay being who you became instead." The producer didn't know what to say to that. "The kid at Newport," Dylan continued. "He thought he was going to change the world with songs. Maybe he did. I don't know. But what I know now is that the world changes you right back. And if you're lucky, you survive it. You become someone who can look back at who you were and not hate them for their certainty, or yourself for losing it." He picked up his guitar. "That's the song I've been trying to write for 40 years. And I still don't know how it ends. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered." The recording from that night circulated among collectors. Poor audio quality, recorded on someone's phone, but you could hear it clearly, the moment when Dylan stops. The young voice filling the arena. The silence. The chair scraping. And then, eventually, the old voice returning to finish what the young voice had started. Dylan never spoke about it publicly. When asked in interviews about the Madison Square Garden incident, he'd deflect or change the subject. But 2 years later he included, "It's alright, Ma," in every set list. Played the way he played it that night, slow, heavy, like a man carrying something he'd finally made peace with. A journalist once asked him why he kept performing songs from 50 years ago. "Aren't you tired of them?" Dylan smiled that crooked smile. "They're not the same songs. I'm not the same person. Everything's different except the words. And maybe that's the point." The young voice from 1965 and the old voice from 2009 singing the same lyrics. That was the whole story of Bob Dylan. Not a prophet. Not a spokesman. Just a musician who got older, like everyone does, and learn that surviving your own legend is harder than becoming one. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The folding chair from that night sits in Dylan's home. He's never said why he kept it. But those who know him say he sits in it sometimes, late at night, listening to old recordings. Not to remember who he was. To understand who he became.